Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Have you ever wondered what might be hiding in the most mundane things? Like a camera. A camera that once belonged to someone you'll never meet. A camera that might carry something far darker than you can imagine. I found it at the back of a dusty second-hand store on a dreary Saturday afternoon. It wasn't the type of place you'd expect to find anything of value. The shelves were cluttered with forgotten trinkets, broken lamps, old books, and faded records. But there, wedged between a set of tarnished silver spoons and a box of forgotten toys, was an old camera. It wasn't like any camera I'd seen before, made of weathered leather and metal, with a faint rust stain creeping across the edges. It looked like something out of a past decade, maybe even a past century. The price tag was worn, but I could still make out the numbers, $5. I didn't think twice. I bought it immediately, a strange sense of nostalgia pulling me in, as if the camera had somehow belonged to me long before I ever laid eyes on it. When I brought it home, I didn't know what to expect. The shopkeeper had mentioned it was broken, but I wasn't concerned. I just wanted to see what kind of photos it had taken, to peek into the past through the lens of someone else's memories. I loaded it with a roll of film I had lying around and turned the dial. The camera clicked. A faint click, almost like a sigh of relief, as though it hadn't been used in years. I snapped a few test shots around my apartment, trying to get a feel for it. The flash was weak and the lens foggy, but I didn't mind. It was part of the charm, the mystery. As the evening wore on, I started developing the film. The darkroom smelled of chemicals and old paper, a scent I hadn't experienced in years. I hung each photo carefully on the line, waiting to see what would come out. One by one, they appeared, slightly off-kilter but still familiar. Pictures of my living room, my bookshelf, the window with the fading light outside. And then there was the last one. At first glance, it seemed like any other picture. But something was wrong. There was a shadow in the corner of the frame, something that didn't belong. It wasn't just darkness, it was the shape of a person, a figure that wasn't there when I took the photo. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was unclear, but I could make out the outline of a face. It wasn't mine. I couldn't remember anyone being in the room with me. I dismissed it as a trick of the light, something my tired eyes hadn't picked up at the time. But as I looked closer, the figure seemed to be closer than it had been when the picture was taken. I grabbed another roll of film. I had to know if it was just a fluke. The next day, I used the camera again. The picture quality had worsened, but the shadow was still there. This time, the figure was more defined, its outline clearer, its shape more distinct. I felt a chill, deep in my bones. I couldn't ignore it anymore. With each photo I took, the figure in the corner of the frame grew nearer. It was no longer a vague outline. It was becoming a person. No, not a person. Something else. I couldn't stop. I had to keep taking photos, each one worse than the last, each one more unsettling. The figure had eyes now, and they were staring right at me. But I didn't know what to do. I was gripped by something I couldn't explain. The camera had become my obsession. It wasn't just the photos that disturbed me. The camera itself seemed to change with every passing moment. I'd pick it up, and the weight felt different, heavier somehow. The leather strap seemed to creak as if it was alive, like it was anticipating the next shot. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those eyes, black and hollow, staring at me from the shadows. The closer I got to the figure in the photos, the more real it felt. It wasn't just a camera. It wasn't just an object. It was pulling me deeper into something I couldn't control. I kept the camera by my side even when I wasn't using it. I couldn't bring myself to leave it alone. The strange pull was too strong, as though it was calling to me. Each click of the shutter was like a promise, a step closer to understanding what was happening, even though I was terrified of what I might find. That night, I went to bed with the camera beside me, its cold, metallic surface pressing against my skin. I tried to sleep, but the images from the photos kept flashing in my mind, blurred, shifting faces, figures that shouldn't exist. Every time I blinked, I could hear the faint click of the camera, even though it was silent. I woke up to a noise. It was faint, but unmistakable. A shuffling sound, like someone moving in the room. My heart pounded as I sat up in bed, glancing around the darkness. The air felt thick, as if the room had changed somehow, become heavier. I reached for the camera instinctively, my hand trembling. When I turned it on, the lens seemed to focus on something in the corner of the room before I even lifted it to my eye. And then I saw it. The shadow. It wasn't on the film yet. But in the dim light of the room, it stood there, taller now, more distinct. Its outline had become clearer. Its eyes were wide open, but they were still empty, staring directly at me. I snapped a photo, the camera's click sounding too loud in the silence. I didn't want to look at the picture, but I had to. My fingers fumbled as I developed the film in haste. When the last image appeared, I gasped. The shadow was standing just inches away from me. The figure was no longer distant, it was right there, so close it felt like it was breathing down my neck. I felt something shift in the air, a sudden pressure, an oppressive presence that seemed to grow stronger with every second. My mind raced. What was it? How was it getting closer? I had to leave. I had to get away from the camera, from whatever was stalking me through the lens. I couldn't stay in the apartment anymore, but the thought of leaving it behind, of losing it, was unbearable. The idea that something in that camera was connected to whatever this thing was, something that was chasing me, finding me in each photo, kept me rooted to the spot. I ran to the door, but when I opened it, there was nothing. The hallway was empty, silent. I closed it behind me, but when I turned to face the room, I froze. The shadow was no longer in the corner. It was standing in the doorway, and its eyes were looking directly at me. I couldn't breathe. My heart was hammering in my chest, a dull thud that seemed to echo louder than anything else in the room. My legs trembled, but I couldn't move. The figure, this thing, was standing there, its presence filling the doorway like a dark curtain. I tried to convince myself that I was just seeing things. Maybe the exhaustion was messing with my mind, making shadows take on shapes. But when I blinked, it didn't go away. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't some fleeting moment of paranoia. The figure was real. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt dry, constricted, as though my body itself was trying to silence me. I looked down at the camera in my hands, as if it held the answer. As if snapping another photo could explain this, could make it stop. But my hand shook so violently that the camera almost slipped from my fingers. I couldn't focus. I couldn't think. And then, in that moment of panic, I heard it, a low, guttural sound coming from the shadow. A soft whisper that wasn't words, but a feeling, a weight in my chest. Turn the page, it seemed to say, though its lips never moved. I stared, wide-eyed, the air thick with terror. What did it mean? Turn the page? The idea was so strange, but at the same time, it felt like the only option. Maybe the camera was part of some larger puzzle. Maybe if I followed whatever twisted logic was unfolding, I could make sense of what was happening. But the shadow didn't wait for me to figure it out. It took a step forward, moving closer, the darkness swirling around it like smoke. I snapped another photo in desperation, the shutter clicking sharply in the heavy silence. The image developed before me. The figure was now closer, so close I could almost feel its cold breath on my skin. The eyes, those empty, black eyes, were wide open, fixed on me. And in that moment, something in its gaze shifted. It was no longer just watching me. It was studying me, waiting. I backed away, my body urging me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, my gaze locked with the shadow. Its presence pressed in on me, suffocating. Another step forward. The figure was inches from me now, its form almost tangible. I could feel a chill in the air, a coldness that went beyond the temperature of the room. It was the coldness of something ancient, something that shouldn't be here. And then, I saw it. The thing that had been hiding in the corner of my vision. Behind the shadow, barely noticeable at first, there was a faint outline of something, more shadows, perhaps. But it wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. It was a face, or what could have been a face, its features distorted, as if it had been stretched out of shape by some unnatural force. The figure stepped closer, its fingers reaching toward me, long and skeletal. I didn't know if it was going to touch me or strangle me or, worse, drag me into whatever dark void it came from. The camera. I lifted it again, my hand shaking uncontrollably, and I snapped one more shot. This time, the sound of the shutter was deafening. The film developed slowly, but when the image appeared, I saw something that stopped my breath entirely. The figure wasn't in the photo anymore. Instead, it was me. I stood frozen in the frame, my face contorted in horror, eyes wide open, staring back at myself. But it wasn't just my reflection. There was something wrong with the way I looked. Something that didn't belong. I looked up from the photo and saw that the figure was gone. The doorway was empty. The air had cleared, and for a moment, I almost dared to believe I had imagined it all. But I knew better now. I turned back to the camera, and there, on the film, was the last photo, the one I hadn't taken yet. The shadow had come for me. It had taken something from me. And it wasn't done. The weight of the moment crushed me. I stood there, the photograph in my hands trembling, trying to piece together what had just happened. I had snapped the photo. I had done everything right. But it wasn't right. It shouldn't have been. I felt it now, creeping into my bones, a gnawing, insidious sense that I wasn't just being watched. I was being followed. A noise came from somewhere behind me. A soft shuffle, like footsteps across the floor. I whipped around, expecting to see someone, something, but the room was empty. The only sound was my own ragged breath and the pounding of my heart in my chest. My body felt cold, as if I had been standing still in an ice storm for hours. But the air, it felt wrong. Dense, thick with something that wasn't supposed to be there. I tried to shake it off. Get a grip, I told myself, breathing shallowly. It's just a camera. A stupid, old camera. It's not real. I glanced down at the photo again, my gaze flicking to the edge of the frame. Something in it moved. I blinked, and there it was again, just a flicker at the edge, like something was waiting for me to look. But when I lifted the photo closer to my face, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. No shifting shadows. No ominous presence. Just me. My face. Staring back. I could feel my pulse quicken. It wasn't enough to calm my nerves. I needed to find answers, but I had no idea where to start. I couldn't stop looking at the photo, at my own reflection, because somewhere deep in my gut, I knew it was wrong. I threw the photo down on the table and backed away, but the silence in the room made everything feel too loud. The whisper of the shadows seemed to pulse in my mind, a constant reminder that something was wrong. Something had found its way in. I moved toward the door, every instinct screaming at me to get out, to leave this place behind. But as I touched the door handle, I froze. The shadows were back. They moved. Slowly. They crept along the edges of the room like they had always been there, waiting for me to see them. I could hear the faint scratching, like nails against the walls, a sound that shouldn't have been possible. And then, a voice. A cold, hollow voice that didn't come from anywhere. It echoed inside my head. "You're mine now." I gasped, spinning around, but the figure wasn't there, not yet. I could feel its presence creeping closer, filling the space like an unrelenting tide. It was just beyond my reach, but I could feel it. Its fingers, invisible but tangible, brushed against the back of my neck. I was trapped. I had to leave. Now. I bolted toward the door, ripping it open and stumbling into the hallway. My feet moved faster than my mind, carried by pure panic. My hands gripped the camera tightly, the cold metal digging into my palm, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't breathe. The hallway stretched on endlessly, the flickering lights above casting long shadows that seemed to move just as quickly as I did. I glanced over my shoulder, convinced I would see it, the shadow, the figure, coming after me. But there was nothing. Just the dark, oppressive silence. I turned a corner and found myself at the staircase. A quick descent to the exit. I could make it. I could. A crash. The sound echoed from above, sharp and violent. A door slamming open. It's here. I stumbled down the stairs, my breath coming in gasps. I wasn't sure what I was running from, but I knew it wasn't just the figure. It was something worse. Something that followed. Something that was always there, waiting for the right moment to claim me. I reached the bottom of the stairs and raced for the front door, only to stop dead in my tracks. The door was shut. No, not shut, locked. And I couldn't unlock it. I turned back. The hallway stretched ahead of me again, like an infinite loop I couldn't escape. The shadows were there, waiting, thickening, growing darker. I could feel them pressing in. The camera. It was still in my hands. The same camera. The same damn camera. The air in the room was thick, almost suffocating. I raised the camera one last time, driven by some instinct I didn't understand, and snapped a photo. The film developed instantly. But this time, there was no shadow. There was no face. Just me. And standing behind me, in the photo, was a figure. One that wasn't there before. one that should never have been there. Its eyes locked with mine. And in that moment, I realized something. It was me. The face in the photo wasn't my own. It was someone else. Someone who had been in that room with me all along. And in the stillness that followed, I understood. There was no escape. It had already taken me. I stood frozen, the camera still clutched in my trembling hands. My eyes were fixed on the photo that had developed in front of me, those hollow, lifeless eyes that seemed to belong to someone who wasn't me. But the more I stared, the more it became clear it wasn't just a photo. It was a warning. A warning that whatever had followed me, whatever had been lurking in the shadows, had already made its way into the world through the lens of this cursed camera. I stepped back, trying to steady myself. The walls felt like they were closing in, pressing against me, making it impossible to breathe. The air around me felt thick with something I couldn't see, but could feel. It was suffocating. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear the sound of my own thoughts. And yet, in the distance, I thought I heard something. A faint whisper. A voice, or maybe the sound of movement, like a shift in the air. But it wasn't just in the distance. It was close. Too close. I spun around, my back slamming into the wall, but I couldn't see anything. The hallway was empty. Still. Silent. But the silence felt wrong. It was as if the quiet had taken on a life of its own. And then it moved. A shadow, deeper than any shadow should have been, stretched across the floor. It crawled toward me, impossibly long, like a dark stain seeping into the walls. I felt it, an almost palpable pressure, pressing down on my chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. I could sense it in the room now, a presence that wasn't mine, a presence that had never been invited. It was the photo. I could feel its influence, the way it had crept into the very fabric of the house, like a virus, infecting everything. It had gone beyond the camera. It had woven itself into the space around me, into the air I was breathing. I turned toward the door, desperate for an escape, but as I reached for the knob, it twisted on its own. I stepped back, panic flooding my veins. The door was opening by itself. I wanted to scream, to shout, but my throat was tight, my voice trapped somewhere inside. The shadows moved with the door, spreading like ink and water, blotting out the light. I backed into the corner, my legs shaking beneath me. My hands were still gripping the camera, but it was as if it had taken control of me. The lens, the film, the shadows, it was all connected. I could feel the weight of the past photographs bearing down on me, the ones I had taken before, the ones that were beginning to come to life. I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't fight it. But I knew one thing, I had to destroy it. This camera. This cursed object that had brought everything into being. I flung the camera to the ground, stomping on it with everything I had. The glass shattered. The lens cracked. But even as the camera broke, the shadows didn't fade. They only seemed to grow darker, like they were feeding off the destruction, becoming stronger. I fell to my knees, gasping for air, feeling my hands tremble uncontrollably. The photo was still in my grip, as if it had merged with my own skin, unwilling to let go. And then I heard it. A laugh. It was soft at first, like the rustling of dry leaves, but then it grew louder, more distinct. The voice was unmistakable, cold, mocking, and familiar. It was my own voice. It echoed in my head, surrounding me, becoming everything. You can't destroy what's already inside you. The walls around me began to warp, twisting, like they were being drawn into the center of the room. I could see the outlines of faces now, faces I knew, faces I recognized from the photos. They moved in the shadows, their eyes hollow and empty, staring at me as though they had always been here. I closed my eyes, hoping it would stop, hoping it was just some terrible nightmare. But when I opened them again, the shadows were there, even closer now, pressing against my skin. It wasn't a dream. And as the darkness took over, as it swallowed the room whole, I realized with chilling clarity, I had never been the one taking the photos. I had always been the subject, the object, the thing captured in every shot. I had never been the photographer. I had always been the victim. And now, the camera, the shadow, it owned me. There was no escaping. There was only the last photo, the one that would never end. Have you ever felt like someone was watching you? The voice on the line was low, almost a whisper, and it sent a chill down my spine. It was my third night working the graveyard shift at the call center. My job was simple: answer calls, listen to complaints, and forward issues to the relevant departments. The pay wasn't great, but the hours were quiet, and I needed the solitude. The first 2 nights had been uneventful: calls about lost packages, billing errors, and occasional rants from sleepless insomniacs. But tonight was different. The voice belonged to a man, soft-spoken yet unsettling. He didn't sound angry or upset, just strange. "I'm sorry, sir. Could you repeat that?" I asked, trying to sound professional despite the unease creeping into my chest. "Have you ever felt like someone is watching you?" he repeated. "Even when you're alone?" I forced a nervous laugh. That's an unusual question for a customer service call. "Is there something I can help you with?" Silence filled the line, thick and heavy. For a moment, I thought he'd hung up. Then, his voice returned, quieter than before. "You dropped your pen." My heart stopped. I looked down. The pen I'd been twirling absent-mindedly a moment ago was now on the floor. "Who is this?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "You shouldn't leave your curtains open," he continued, ignoring my question. "The street light outside casts such a clear shadow into your room." A shiver ran down my spine. My apartment was small, just a 1-bedroom unit on the 2nd floor of an old building. From where I sat at my desk, I could see the open living room window. The curtains were slightly parted, and the street light outside did indeed spill its pale orange glow into the room. I stood, my chair scraping against the floor. "How do you know that?" The man chuckled softly, a sound that felt like nails on glass. "I know a lot of things," he said. "Like the way you check your phone every few minutes, even though no one's messaged you in hours. Or the way you keep glancing at the clock, wishing this shift would end." My stomach churned. I scanned the room, every shadow suddenly alive with menace. The small desk lamp on my table seemed woefully inadequate against the dark corners of the room. "Stop calling," I snapped, my voice trembling. "I'll report this to the police if you don't stop." "You won't," he said confidently. "You don't even know who I am. Besides, I'm not here to hurt you. I just wanted to talk." The line went dead. For a moment, I stood there, clutching the phone, my mind racing. Was this a prank? A coincidence? My eyes darted to the window again. Slowly, I walked over and yanked the curtains closed, shutting out the streetlight. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching, waiting. I spent the rest of the shift in a haze of paranoia, jumping at every creak and groan of my old apartment. The building had always made noises, pipes rattling, floorboards settling, but tonight they felt deliberate, like whispers just out of earshot. The next night, I told myself I'd been overreacting. It was probably a prank. Someone had guessed about the pen or the open window. Maybe they'd seen me through the street-facing window earlier and decided to mess with me. Still, I made sure to keep the curtains tightly shut. The calls started normally enough, routine issues, tired voices on the other end of the line. I began to relax, convincing myself the previous night had been a fluke. But around midnight, the phone rang, and as soon as I picked up, my stomach tightened. "You moved the lamp," the voice said. It was him. My blood ran cold. I looked at the small desk lamp, now placed on the far corner of my table, where I moved it earlier for better lighting. My throat felt dry, but I forced myself to speak. "Who are you?" I demanded. "That doesn't matter," he replied calmly. "What matters is how predictable you are. You think closing the curtains and shifting a lamp will keep you safe? It's almost cute." I slammed the phone down, my hands trembling. This wasn't a prank. Whoever this was, they were watching me right now. My first instinct was to call the police, but what would I say? That someone had guessed about my lamp? That I felt watched? Without concrete proof, they'd chalk it up to nerves or paranoia. The phone rang again, and I stared at it, my pulse pounding in my ears. It rang once, twice. On the third ring, I picked it up, my voice a shaky whisper. "What do you want from me?" The line was silent at first, save for the faint sound of breathing. Then, the voice spoke, softer than before. "Do you ever wonder why you're always alone?" I froze. The question hit deeper than I cared to admit. How could he know that? How could he know the quiet emptiness that followed me everywhere, even when I wasn't at work? "You don't know anything about me," I spat, trying to mask the crack in my voice. "I know more than you think," he said. "Like how you haven't unpacked the boxes in your closet. Or how you keep a baseball bat under your bed, just in case." My knees felt weak, and I sank into the chair. He was right. I hadn't unpacked since I moved in 6 months ago. The bat was there too, a relic of a fleeting sense of security. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Because I can," he replied. "And because you'll keep listening. You can't help yourself." The line went dead again. I sat there, staring at the phone, my thoughts a tangled mess of fear and disbelief. My apartment felt smaller, the walls closing in around me. Every shadow seemed to shift, every sound amplified. Desperate for some sense of control, I checked the locks on the door and windows, making sure everything was secure. Then, I grabbed the baseball bat from under the bed and sat down in the middle of the room, the phone still in my hand. The night stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. By the time the sun rose, I felt hollow, like the person I'd been the day before had been stripped away layer by layer. But one thought lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. If he could see me so clearly, how close was he? The next day, exhaustion hung over me like a heavy fog, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined shadows creeping closer, unseen eyes boring into me. I skipped breakfast, lunch, and everything in between, pacing my apartment with the baseball bat in hand. I didn't feel safe, not in the daylight, not anywhere. When my shift began that evening, I logged in reluctantly, every fiber of my being screaming at me to quit, to leave, to run. But where would I go? The job was my only source of income, and even if I left, how could I be sure he wouldn't follow me? The first few calls were routine. A woman complaining about a double charge. A man asking for a refund. For a brief moment, I convinced myself that tonight would be normal. That maybe, somehow, he decided to leave me alone. But then, at exactly 11:30, the phone rang. My hand hesitated over the receiver, my heartbeat thundering in my chest. I didn't want to answer, but the ringing felt relentless, a taunt I couldn't ignore. With trembling fingers, I picked up. "Hello," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't sleep today," he said immediately, his tone almost conversational. My stomach dropped. How could he know that? "Are you watching me?" I demanded, anger bubbling up to mask the fear. "How are you doing this?" There was a long pause, and then he sighed, as though disappointed. "You don't get it, do you?" he said softly. "This isn't about me watching you. This is about you watching yourself. You're the one who left your curtains open for weeks. You're the one who walks the same route to the corner store every night. You make it so easy to see who you are." I felt sick. He wasn't just watching me, he'd been studying me, learning my habits, my weaknesses. "Why me?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Because you're alone," he said simply. "No one notices you. No one will come if you scream. You've built your life like this, piece by piece." I clenched the phone tighter, tears stinging my eyes. "You're wrong," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" he asked. "Do you want to test it?" There was a knock at the door. I froze, the phone slipping slightly in my grip. The knock was soft but deliberate, the kind that demanded attention. "Don't open it," the man said on the line, his voice suddenly sharp. "Why not?" I whispered, barely able to form the words. "Because it's not me." My blood turned to ice. "Who is it, then?" I asked, my voice trembling. "That," he said, his tone almost amused, "is what you're about to find out." The line went dead. For a moment, I couldn't move, my body paralyzed by fear. The knock came again, louder this time. I crept toward the door, clutching the baseball bat like a lifeline. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a neighbor? The landlord? Someone who needed help? I looked through the peephole, my breath catching in my throat. There was no one there. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by the single flickering bulb above the stairwell. I stepped back from the door, my heart pounding. I didn't trust this. I didn't trust any of it. Then I heard it. A faint sound coming from the other side of the room. It was soft at first, like the shuffle of fabric against the floor. Slowly, I turned, my eyes scanning the shadows. And that's when I saw it. The curtain, the one I had closed so carefully, was moving. It billowed gently, as though something, or someone, was standing behind it. My grip on the baseball bat tightened, my palms slick with sweat. The curtain swayed ever so slightly, as if touched by a breath of air from a window I knew was shut. I forced myself to move, one cautious step at a time, the floor creaking beneath me. The room felt suffocating, the air heavy with a silence that screamed louder than any noise. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice breaking. No answer. The curtain continued to move, a slow, deliberate sway that sent a chill racing down my spine. My mind reeled with possibilities. Was it him? Had he somehow gotten in? Or was this something worse, something I couldn't explain? I took another step forward, raising the bat. My shadow stretched across the wall, distorted and menacing in the dim light. "I'm calling the police," I shouted, though the words felt hollow. The phone was still on the desk, too far to reach without turning my back. The curtain stopped moving. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, a silence so complete that I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Then, from behind the curtain, a sound, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't words, not exactly. It was more like the echo of words, something just out of reach, like a voice in a dream you can't quite grasp. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I lunged forward and yanked the curtain aside, the bat ready to swing. There was nothing there. I stood there, heart racing, staring at the empty window. The glass was cold to the touch, the lock still in place. Outside, the streetlight cast its familiar glow, the world beyond my apartment eerily still. I let out a shaky breath, the bat lowering slightly. Had I imagined it? Was I losing my mind? The phone rang. The sound sliced through the silence like a knife, making me jump. My heart hammered as I turned toward the desk, the bat slipping from my fingers. It was him. It had to be. I picked up the receiver, my hand trembling. "You're braver than I thought," he said, his voice as calm and composed as ever. How are you doing this?" I stammered. "You're asking the wrong questions," he replied. "The how doesn't matter. What matters is the why." "Then why?" I snapped, anger breaking through my fear. "Why me? What do you want?" There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, softer, almost pitying. "Because you're the kind of person who would pick up the phone. Even now, even after everything, you're still listening. You can't help yourself." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could speak, the lights went out. The sudden darkness was absolute, swallowing the room in an instant. I dropped the phone, my breathing ragged as I fumbled for the bat. A new sound filled the air, one that made my skin crawl, a low, rhythmic creaking, like footsteps on the wooden floor. They were slow, deliberate, and they were getting closer. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The creaking stopped. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, his voice came again, but this time it wasn't on the phone. "You should have left the curtains open." I turned toward the sound, my pulse racing, but the room remained pitch black. I swung the bat blindly, the air whistling with each desperate arc. A soft chuckle echoed around me, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then I felt it, a cold hand brushing against my shoulder. I screamed, spinning around and swinging the bat with all my strength. It hit nothing but air. The cold touch lingered on my shoulder, as if mocking me, daring me to act. My heart thundered in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness was suffocating, impenetrable. The chuckle came again, closer this time, and I stumbled back, gripping the bat so tightly that my knuckles ached. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" The air seemed to shift, thickening around me. Then, his voice came from right beside my ear, so close that I could feel the icy breath on my skin. "I'm not watching you," he whispered. I'm with you. Panic surged through me, and I lashed out with the bat, spinning wildly, desperate to hit something, anything. But the room remained empty, the darkness alive with unseen eyes and unheard footsteps. My foot caught on something, I didn't know what, and I fell hard, the bat clattering out of my hands. I scrambled backward, my palms scraping against the floor. And then, the lights flickered back on. The room was empty. I sat there, gasping for breath, my eyes darting around the apartment. The desk, the window, the tightly closed curtains, everything was exactly as it had been. But the phone was off the hook, the receiver lying on the floor a few feet away. I crawled toward it, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. The line was dead, a hollow static filling my ear. For a moment, I thought it was over. That maybe I had imagined it all. But then I saw it, on the window, faint but unmistakable. A handprint. It was smeared across the glass, long fingers trailing downward as if whoever had left it had been dragged away. The phone buzzed in my hand, a sudden, jarring sound that made me flinch. The screen lit up. Unknown caller. I stared at it, frozen, my mind screaming at me not to answer. But my fingers moved on their own, pressing the green button. I held the phone to my ear, my breath caught in my throat. I told you, the voice said, calm and final. You can't escape what you let in. The line went dead. The lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness. But this time, I didn't hear footsteps. I heard breathing. And it wasn't mine. That night, I left the apartment. I didn't pack, didn't turn off the lights, I just ran. But no matter where I went, no matter how far, I couldn't escape the feeling that someone was always just behind me. Waiting. Watching. And now, every time the phone rings, I wonder if it's him. If he's still there, whispering on the line, reminding me that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Have you ever woken up with the unshakable feeling that something was wrong even before you opened your eyes? That was me on that freezing winter morning. The air in my room was colder than it should have been, the faint sound of the wind outside muffled by the snow that had been falling steadily all night. I live alone in a small house on the edge of town. Quiet. Peaceful. Or at least, it had always felt that way. Pulling on a sweater, I shuffled to the kitchen to make coffee. As I poured water into the kettle, I glanced out the window at the backyard. The snow was pristine, untouched except for a trail of footprints. At first, I didn't register what was strange about them. They were small, maybe from someone wearing boots. But as I followed the trail with my eyes, a chill unrelated to the weather crept over me. The footprints didn't lead to the house, they started at my back door. I put the kettle down and walked to the door, pulling the curtain aside to get a better look. The snow around the house was smooth, unbroken except for that one trail of prints. They began directly at the door, as though someone had stepped out of my house in the middle of the night. But that was impossible. I hadn't gone outside, and I hadn't had any visitors in weeks. I opened the door cautiously, the icy air biting at my skin. The footprints were fresh, the edges crisp against the white snow. They stopped after only a few steps, disappearing completely in the middle of the yard. It didn't make sense. I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. My thoughts raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe an animal had brushed past the door, or maybe the snow had covered the rest of the trail. But deep down, I knew neither of those made sense. As I stood there, staring out at the empty yard, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. A gnawing unease, like the house wasn't as empty as it seemed. I spent the day trying to distract myself, but the image of those footprints lingered. I avoided the back door, shutting the curtain tightly. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking it. But as night fell and the wind picked up, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. The house felt colder than usual, the old heating system struggling against the winter chill. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows before heading to bed, telling myself I was being paranoid. I woke up in the middle of the night, heart pounding for no reason I could explain. The house was silent, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. Pulling the blanket tighter around me, I listened for any sound, creaks, footsteps, anything. But there was nothing. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep, though it was a restless, uneasy sleep filled with strange dreams I couldn't quite remember. When morning came, I hesitated before looking out the window again. My breath fogged the glass as I leaned closer, peeking through the curtain. The footprints were back. This time, they were in the front yard, leading from the street to my front door. They stopped just short of the porch, as if whoever, or whatever, had made them had decided not to knock. I stood there, staring at the trail, my mind racing. How had they appeared overnight? I hadn't heard anything. The worst part was that they were the same size as the ones in the backyard. Small, precise, and far too deliberate to be an accident. I stepped back from the window, a knot tightening in my stomach. Something wasn't right, and I was starting to think it wasn't going to go away. I spent the day trying to convince myself it was all explainable. Maybe a neighbor's kid was playing a prank. Maybe someone had walked through the yard without realizing how strange it looked. But the unease wouldn't let go. Every time I walked past the windows, I found myself peeking out, half expecting to see something or someone standing there. By the time evening came, the snow had started falling again, thick flakes blanketing the ground and erasing the footprints. For a moment, I felt relief. Maybe the snow would bury more than the tracks. Maybe it would take away the sense of dread that had followed me all day. I closed all the curtains, turned on every light in the house, and tried to keep busy. I cleaned the kitchen, sorted through the mail, even turned on the TV for background noise. Anything to keep my mind from wandering back to the footprints. But the longer the night stretched on, the harder it became to ignore the silence pressing in from outside. It was nearly midnight when I heard it, a sound so faint that I wasn't sure I'd heard it at all. A soft crunch, like someone stepping on fresh snow. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. The TV was still on, the low hum of voices filling the room, but I muted it, straining to hear. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the wind outside and the faint creaks of the house settling. And then, there it was again. Another crunch. This time, it was unmistakable. It was coming from the backyard. I grabbed my coat and a flashlight, my heart pounding as I made my way to the back door. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to stay inside, to call someone, anyone. But I had to know. I unlocked the door and stepped out onto the porch, the cold air biting at my face. The snow glistened under the moonlight, untouched except for... I stopped. The footprints were back. They started at the middle of the yard, the same place they had ended the first morning, and led straight toward the house. Toward me. I shone the flashlight over the yard, my breath fogging in the air. There was no sign of anyone. No movement, no sound, just the silent snow and those impossibly fresh footprints. Hello? I called out, my voice shaky. Nothing. I took a step forward, my boots crunching in the snow. The footprints were smaller than mine, too small for an adult. They looked deliberate, each step evenly spaced, but there was no sign of where they had come from. It was as if they had appeared out of nowhere. I followed them as far as I dared, stopping a few feet from where they began. The snow was undisturbed in every direction. No trail leading in. I turned back toward the house, a chill crawling up my spine. The footprints were perfectly aligned, heading straight for the back door. I couldn't explain it, but the sight of them filled me with a sense of dread so strong that it felt like a weight on my chest. I backed away, nearly tripping over the edge of the porch, and hurried inside. I locked the door behind me, double-checking it before pulling the curtain shut. My hands were shaking as I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. The TV flickered in the corner of the room, the muted images casting eerie shadows across the walls. I stood there for what felt like hours, listening to the silence, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then it did. A knock at the front door. Not loud, not frantic. Just a single, deliberate knock. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. No one knocked on my door at this hour. No one came to my house unannounced. Slowly, I crept toward the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. The porch was empty. But there, in the fresh snow, was a new set of footprints. They started at the middle of the yard, just like before. But this time, they didn't stop at the door. This time, they circled the house. I stared at the footprints, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. They looped around the house in a perfect circle, stopping at every window, every door. Someone, or something, had been watching me. The knock came again. This time, it wasn't at the front door. It was at the kitchen window. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The curtains were still drawn, but the sound was unmistakable. A deliberate, almost polite knock. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. Silence. I reached for the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a heavy candlestick from the mantel, and edged toward the window. My reflection stared back at me in the dark glass, pale and wide-eyed. Another knock, softer this time. I yanked the curtain aside, the candlestick raised. Nothing. The snow outside was undisturbed, the footprints frozen in their haunting pattern. The knock hadn't come from outside, it couldn't have. I backed away from the window, the floor creaking beneath me. My pulse thundered in my ears as I tried to think, to make sense of it all. And then I heard it. A whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. A voice, low and distorted, coming from the walls. "You let me in." The words sent a cold rush through my body. I looked around the room, my eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. "Who are you?" I shouted, gripping the candlestick tighter. The voice didn't answer. But the whispering didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, like a dozen voices overlapping, speaking words I couldn't understand. I stumbled back into the living room, my head spinning. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air thick and suffocating. The lights flickered, casting the room in a sickly, stuttering glow. And then, for a brief moment, they went out entirely. When they came back on, the whispering stopped. But I wasn't alone. In the reflection of the living room window, I saw a figure standing behind me. I turned, swinging the candlestick with all my strength. It hit nothing but air. The room was empty. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. I turned back to the window, and my stomach dropped. The figure was still there, faint and translucent, watching me from inside the glass. It didn't move, didn't speak. Just stared with eyes that didn't seem human, dark and hollow. And then, slowly, it raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. I backed away, the candlestick slipping from my fingers. The figure's handprint lingered on the window, faint but unmistakable, as if the frost itself had formed its shape. The lights flickered again, and when they steadied, the figure was gone. But the handprint remained. I stumbled into the kitchen, grabbing my phone with shaking hands. My fingers fumbled over the screen as I dialed the police. The line clicked, and a voice answered. 911, what's your emergency? I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could, the whispering started again. This time, it came from the phone. You let me in, the voice repeated, clearer now. You can't make me leave. The line went dead. I dropped the phone, my hands trembling. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. But beneath the sound, I heard something else, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Footsteps. They were coming from the roof. The tapping on the roof was deliberate, unhurried, like someone pacing above me. I froze, every nerve in my body on edge. It didn't make sense. There was no way someone could have climbed onto the roof without leaving tracks in the snow. But the sound was undeniable, growing louder with each passing second. Gripping the candlestick again, I crept toward the center of the house, where the sound seemed to echo the most. My breath fogged the cold air, and the lights flickered as if the house itself were alive, responding to whatever had invaded it. The footsteps stopped. Then came the scratching. It was soft at first, a faint scrape against the ceiling. But soon it grew louder, more insistent, like nails dragging across wood. My pulse quickened, and I backed toward the wall, the cold pressing against my spine. And then the voice came again. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was loud, resonating through the house, chilling me to my core. You can't hide from me. I dropped the candlestick, my hands covering my ears. The voice was everywhere, inside me, around me. Get out. I screamed, but my voice felt small, insignificant. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing down on me like a weight. For a moment, I dared to hope that it was over. But then came the knock. It wasn't at the door this time. It was from above, on the ceiling, directly over my head. I stumbled back, my eyes darting to the spot where the sound had come from. The knock came again, harder this time, shaking the light fixture. And then, slowly, it moved. The knocking traveled across the ceiling, following me as I backed into the hallway. It was deliberate, each knock precise, like it was tracking me. My foot caught on the edge of the rug, and I fell hard onto the floor. The knocking stopped abruptly, and I held my breath, staring up at the ceiling. That's why I saw it. A dark stain spreading slowly across the plaster, directly above where I lay. It was thick and black, like oil, dripping down in slow, deliberate drops. I scrambled to my feet, slipping on the slick floor as the liquid pooled around me. The smell hit me then, acrid, metallic, like blood. The voice came again, softer now, almost mocking. You let me in, and now I'm everywhere. The lights flickered once more, plunging the house into darkness. And then, I heard the front door creak open. I didn't move, my body frozen in place. The sound of the door opening was slow, deliberate, followed by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on the snow. Whoever, or whatever it was, they were inside now. The floorboards groaned under the weight of something heavy, each step closer than the last. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps stopped just outside the hallway, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then I saw it, a shadow, long and distorted, stretching across the wall. It didn't match anything human. The arms were too long, the head tilted at an unnatural angle. I bit back a scream, clenching my fists as the shadow moved closer. A cold wind swept through the house, extinguishing the last flicker of light. I was plunged into darkness, the only sound my own ragged breathing. And then, I felt it. A hand, ice cold and impossibly strong, resting on my shoulder. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice low and inhuman. I screamed, swinging wildly at the air, but there was nothing to hit. The hand was gone, and the shadow had disappeared. The only thing left was the sound of my own footsteps as I ran toward the front door. When I threw it open, I stumbled into the snow, the freezing air burning my lungs. But the yard wasn't empty. The footprints were everywhere now, crisscrossing the snow in chaotic patterns. They didn't make sense. Some started and stopped abruptly, others spiraled out into impossible shapes. And in the center of it all was a figure. It stood motionless, facing the house. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, unblinking and hungry. The wind howled around me as I backed away, my legs shaking. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. But then, with slow, deliberate steps, it began to walk toward me. I didn't know how much time had passed since the figure started walking toward me. The snow swirled around its form, the flakes dancing in the moonlight like restless spirits. The air felt thicker now, heavier, as though the world itself was holding its breath. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat pounding in my ears. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were made of stone, frozen in place. Every part of me screamed to move, to escape, but my body wouldn't obey. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It was close now, so close that I could make out the faint outline of its form against the swirling white of the storm. It didn't seem to move like a person. There was no natural sway to its gait. Each step was calculated, precise, like it knew exactly where I was and where I would be. And then I heard it, the same whisper from before, soft and insidious, curling into my mind like smoke. "You can't outrun what you've invited in." The words cut through me like ice. The realization hit me all at once, and I understood. This wasn't just a figure. It wasn't just a person. This thing, whatever it was, had been following me from the moment those footprints first appeared. It had been waiting, drawing me into a trap. I stumbled backward, my breath coming out in harsh gasps. My hand reached behind me, fingers brushing against the cold metal of the door handle. I was so close, but the figure was closer. I couldn't make it back inside. I knew that. The figure stopped just a few feet away, its face still hidden in shadow. I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive. The cold seeped into my skin, numbing my bones, and I knew with a sickening certainty that it wasn't going to let me escape. "You invited me," it said again, and I realized the voice wasn't just in my head. It was coming from everywhere, from the snow, the wind, the very air around me. "Now, you must pay the price." I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. My body was frozen, unable to move or respond. It was as if the world had turned to ice, each second stretching out in agonizing silence. And then, Just as I thought I couldn't bear it anymore, the figure took one final step toward me. But it wasn't a step like the others. This one was different. It was almost final. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble as its foot hit the snow. And in that moment, I knew what was coming. Everything went black. When I awoke, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The wind had stopped. The storm was gone, leaving only the stillness of the night behind. My breath came out in quick, shallow gasps, and I sat up, disoriented, my head spinning. The world was eerily quiet. I looked around, and at first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. The snow was still there, blanketing the ground, but the footprints, the ones that had haunted me for so long, were gone. The yard was undisturbed, as if nothing had ever happened. I staggered to my feet, my legs weak, and turned toward the house. The door was still open, the inside dark and empty. It was as if everything had reset. As if the last few days, the terror, the shadow, had all been erased. But then, just as I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, I had imagined it all, I saw something in the snow at my feet. A single, faint imprint, almost imperceptible against the white expanse. A footprint. Small. Deliberate. It started at my feet and led back toward the house. And this time, there were no more footsteps behind me. The figure was already inside. Have you ever felt like something was watching you? Not just a passing thought, but a persistent feeling that claws at your mind? I didn't believe in such things until now. It started with a storm. A blizzard like I had never seen before. The wind howled outside, rattling windows and shaking the old building. I had taken shelter inside the first place I could find, an abandoned structure at the edge of town. The door had creaked open as if inviting me in, offering the only refuge from the cold that threatened to freeze me to the bone. I knew the place was old, its walls cracked and peeling, the floorboards groaning under my weight, but something about it felt wrong. The air was thick, damp, and smelled of mildew, but there was another scent, something that I couldn't quite place. I had a decay, of something lost. I had no intention of staying long. Just long enough to catch my breath, warm up, and figure out my next move. The storm wasn't going to let up any time soon. But when I tried to leave, the door wouldn't open. I assumed it was just the wind. The door was old, and maybe the frame had swollen with moisture. I tried pushing again, harder this time, but it wouldn't budge. The handle rattled, but the door stayed firmly shut. I didn't panic. Not yet. I had to find another way out. There had to be another exit. So, I moved through the building, looking for any door or window that might give me an escape. The air grew colder as I walked deeper into the structure, the eerie silence wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. Each step echoed through the empty hallways, amplifying my own sense of isolation. The building felt alive, as though it were waiting for something. Then, I found a door at the end of a long corridor. A simple wooden door, closed but not locked. I pushed it open, and it creaked as if reluctant to reveal what lay beyond. The room inside was dimly lit, with sunlight filtering weakly through the grime-coated windows. The space was filled with old furniture, some of it overturned, others draped in dusty sheets. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I moved in cautiously, the feeling of being watched growing stronger. I checked the door behind me. It had closed on its own. I hadn't thought much of it at first, but now I noticed something strange. The lock, which had been on the outside of the door, was now on the inside. I couldn't understand how it had happened. My heart began to race as I twisted the handle. It wouldn't budge. I tried not to panic. I had to think. There had to be a way out. I moved to the window, trying to pry it open, but it was sealed shut by years of neglect. I banged on the glass, but the wind outside drowned out any sound I made. There was no way out. I turned to the other doors in the room, each one locked. Every handle I tried was either frozen or jammed. Desperation began to set in. How had I gotten trapped here? Why was every exit blocked? My mind raced with possible explanations. Had someone locked me in? Or was I simply overreacting? The storm outside still howled, but that didn't explain the strange feeling settling deep in my chest. I took a deep breath and tried to steady myself. Panic wouldn't help. I needed to stay calm. I checked the room again, more carefully this time. There had to be something I was missing. It wasn't until I noticed the small table in the corner of the room that I realized something wasn't right. Sitting on the table was a small key, old and tarnished. It gleamed in the dim light, almost as if it were calling to me. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. I didn't know why, but I felt compelled to try it. I walked to the nearest door, slipped the key into the lock, and turned it. The door clicked open, but what lay behind it wasn't what I expected. Another room, identical to the first one. Same dim lighting, same forgotten furniture. The air still thick with dust. I stood there, frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of what was happening. How could this be? How could there be another room exactly like the first one, hidden behind a locked door? Before I could fully process it, the door behind me slammed shut. The sound was deafening. I spun around, my heart racing. The room, this new room, wasn't empty. The air felt heavier now, the oppressive silence even more suffocating. And the door that I had just unlocked? It was gone. No longer visible, no longer an option. Instead, there was a single new door in front of me, slightly ajar. I took a shaky breath. My mind screamed for me to stop, to find another way, but something, some force beyond my understanding, compelled me forward. I walked toward the new door, the key still clutched tightly in my hand. I had no idea what was waiting for me on the other side. But I knew one thing for certain, I wasn't going to find my way out this easily. The door creaked open with a sound that made my skin crawl, the hinges protesting like a warning I couldn't ignore. But there was no turning back. I stepped through, the cold air rushing at me as the door slammed shut behind me with a finality that sent a shiver down my spine. I looked around. The room was small, just a narrow hallway stretching ahead, barely lit by flickering overhead lights. The walls were bare except for peeling paint and the occasional splintered wooden beam. It didn't look like much, just an ordinary corridor. But I could feel the unease growing inside me, clawing its way into my mind, telling me that this was no ordinary place. There were no windows. No other doors. Just a long, empty hallway. The floor creaked under my feet as I took a step forward, the sound echoing through the silence, unnaturally loud. Each step I took seemed to reverberate, as if the hallway were alive, stretching on forever. I pressed forward, my breath shallow, unsure of what I was walking into. I felt as though I was being drawn into something I couldn't escape, no matter how much I wanted to. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly. The air grew heavier, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every time I turned a corner, every time I tried a door, it was locked or led to another hallway, identical to the one before it. The building wasn't just trapping me. It was playing with me. I stopped in my tracks. There, at the far end of the corridor, was a door. Not just any door, this one was different. It looked older, darker, its wood weathered and cracked. And there, above the doorframe, was a symbol I hadn't noticed before, a faint, almost imperceptible drawing of an eye, its lid half closed, watching me. I knew I shouldn't approach it. There was something wrong about it. But I couldn't help myself. I walked toward the door, my hands trembling as I reached for the handle. It turned easily, and the door opened with a soft groan. Behind it was another room. This time, it was small, almost claustrophobic, filled with old furniture covered in layers of dust. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering sporadically, casting eerie shadows on the walls. But it wasn't the room that made my heart race. It was the door behind me. The one I had just entered through. It was gone. There was no door. No trace of its existence. Panic surged through me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. There was no escape. The room had swallowed me whole, leaving me with nothing but walls closing in. I backed up, my legs trembling, and reached for the nearest door. This one was unlocked. I turned the handle, my pulse quickening as it opened into yet another identical room. The walls, the furniture, the cold, stale air, everything was the same. I had to get out. I moved through the rooms frantically now, each step more desperate than the last. My mind was racing, but nothing made sense. The rooms blurred together, and every door I opened only led to more rooms, more hallways, more locked doors. The building had turned into a labyrinth, an endless maze with no exit in sight. I had no idea how much time had passed. My sense of reality was starting to warp, twisting like the walls around me. The isolation was suffocating. I couldn't tell if I was still in the same place I had started or if I was trapped in some kind of nightmare. The key, the one I had found earlier, was still in my hand. I clutched it tightly, as if it could somehow guide me out of this nightmare. But it had stopped making sense. The more doors I opened, the more confused I became. Each key seemed to unlock something different, but never the right door. Always a new room. Always another hallway. I had unlocked something, but not the exit. Never the exit. The building was toying with me. And I realized, with growing horror, that it wasn't just a building, it was alive. It had been waiting for me. Watching me. Learning my every fear, my every move. And it wasn't done with me yet. A sudden noise, a soft scrape against the floor, pulled me from my thoughts. My breath caught in my throat as I turned toward the sound. There, in the corner of the room, a shadow seemed to shift. It was barely perceptible, but it was there. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind screamed for me to leave, but my legs refused to cooperate. The shadow moved again. Someone, was in here with me. I turned and ran. The hallway seemed endless, stretching on and on as I ran blindly through it, my footsteps pounding on the floor, the echo of my own panic deafening in my ears. The door ahead of me was different this time. It wasn't the same wooden door, but a sleek, metallic one, cold and imposing. A small keyhole sat in the center of it. I fumbled with the key in my hand, my fingers slick with sweat as I tried to force it into the lock. The door opened, but beyond it, I saw nothing but darkness. I had no choice but to step forward. The moment I did, I felt the temperature drop sharply, the chill biting at my skin. The door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the dark. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face, but I could hear something soft, shuffling footsteps. Closer. Closer. I froze. The sound of the footsteps was faint at first, just a distant shuffle of shoes against the cold concrete. But with each passing second, they grew louder, closer, as if someone was moving in the dark with me, stalking me through the void. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the footsteps, making it harder to hear anything else. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, the presence of something just out of reach, something following me in the dark. I tried to move, but my legs felt like lead, stiff and unresponsive. The air around me was thick with tension, suffocating. Every breath I took seemed to echo, amplifying the oppressive silence that threatened to crush me. Then, a faint whisper, a soft, almost inaudible sound just behind me sent a jolt of terror through my spine. I whipped around, but the darkness was absolute. There was nothing there. I was alone. At least, that's what I told myself. The footsteps resumed. Closer. Closer. And then, stop. My skin prickled. The air felt still, too still. It was as if the very room had held its breath, waiting. I reached out, my hands trembling, brushing against the cold, hard walls that surrounded me. I needed to find a way out, fast. But in the dark, I had no sense of direction. Every turn felt the same, every step a disorienting echo. The walls closed in on me, and with each new footfall, the space around me seemed to shrink. The whispering returned, louder this time, a series of unintelligible words. It was a voice, but it didn't sound human. It was twisted, distorted, like a broken recording replaying over and over again. I pressed my hands to my ears, desperate to block it out, but the voice wouldn't stop. I had to get away. With all my strength, I broke into a run, my feet slamming against the ground, my breath ragged in my throat. I needed to outrun the sound, outrun the thing following me. But the harder I ran, the more the footsteps seemed to match my pace. It was like I was being chased, not by a person, but by something far more terrifying. The walls began to change. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but as I rounded the corner, I saw the unmistakable signs of a shift. The walls weren't just cracked, they were bleeding. Small rivulets of dark liquid trickled down the concrete, staining the floor beneath me, leaving a trail that led back to the door I had just entered. The blood, if that's what it was fresh, wet, and smelled of iron. I stopped dead in my tracks, my stomach lurching at the sight. I had to keep moving, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the horrific sight before me. The walls were alive, pulsating with a strange, unnatural rhythm. The liquid seemed to throb, like it had a heartbeat of its own. And then, I heard it. A voice, no longer muffled by the darkness. It was right in front of me, whispering directly into my ear. You can't escape. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty, blood-stained hallway stretching out before me. I was being hunted, but not by anything I could see. I turned back toward the metallic door, my mind racing, trying to come up with a plan. The key was still in my hand, but I knew it wouldn't matter. I'd unlocked doors before, but they didn't lead me to safety. They only led me deeper into this nightmare. The footsteps started again, slow at first, deliberate. They echoed through the hallway, each step timed perfectly with the rhythm of my breathing. They weren't chasing me anymore. They were waiting for me to turn around. I had no choice. I took a deep breath, the air thick with dread, and spun around, bolting toward the source of the footsteps. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever. Each step I took, the echo grew louder, more intense, until it felt like the very walls themselves were closing in around me. My mind was in overdrive, trying to process what was happening, trying to make sense of the impossible. And then I saw it. A figure, tall, indistinct, shrouded in shadow, standing at the far end of the hallway. Its eyes glowed faintly, red, like smoldering embers, watching me. It didn't move. It didn't need to. I could feel it. The presence was overwhelming, as if it were pressing against me, forcing me to acknowledge it. For a brief, fleeting moment, I wondered if I was imagining it. If it was just my mind breaking under the pressure, some sort of hallucination brought on by fear. But then it took a step forward. One slow, deliberate step, and the floor beneath me seemed to groan in response. I tried to move, but my legs were frozen in place. Fear had paralyzed me. It stepped closer. Another step. Then another. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My heart thundered in my chest as the figure advanced, its presence growing stronger, more suffocating. I wanted to scream, to run, but my voice caught in my throat. My body refused to move. It stopped right in front of me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel it. The darkness pressed against me, smothering me. The voice, low, guttural, spoke again, its words echoing in my mind. Fear is the key. And then it was gone. The hallway was empty. Silent. I stood there, gasping for breath, my hands shaking. I was alone again. Or was I? I turned back toward the door, but when I reached for the handle, I felt something cold and wet wrap around my wrist. I looked down. The blood had spread, creeping toward me, reaching for me. It wasn't over. The blood was everywhere now, slowly seeping across the floor, wrapping itself around the soles of my shoes like some kind of liquid vice. I tried to pull my foot back, but the more I struggled, the harder it became to break free. It was as though the blood had a mind of its own, twisting and latching onto me, pulling me deeper into the nightmare. I could feel it now, creeping up my legs, cold and clammy against my skin. My pulse raced as I forced my body into motion, dragging my feet out of the sticky, viscous substance that held me in place. The door. I had to get to the door. The sound of something scraping against the floor made me freeze. I turned, heart pounding, and saw the shadows moving in the corners of my vision. They weren't shadows, they were something else, something alive. The walls seemed to pulse with dark energy, every crack in the concrete seeming to widen, revealing deeper, more sinister spaces within. I reached out for the key that still hung from my pocket, my hands trembling so badly that it was a wonder I managed to grip it at all. The cold metal felt like it burned in my hand as I fumbled with it, desperate to unlock the door that would set me free. I could hear something moving behind me, shifting through the dark, but I dared not turn to look. The key slid into the lock, and for a second, there was only silence. My breath, my heartbeat, the muffled sounds of whatever lurked in the dark, they all seemed to stop. Then the door swung open. It wasn't the way out. Of course it wasn't. It never was. I stepped into the next room, and as the door clicked shut behind me, I immediately knew I had made a mistake. The room was different from the others, too clean, too quiet. The walls were made of smooth glass, giving me a distorted reflection of myself. A strange, unsettling sight, like a figure that didn't quite match the space it inhabited. I stumbled forward, my breath catching in my throat. The walls were closing in, inch by inch, with every step I took. The blood had stopped, but the pressure in the air was worse than ever. There was something else, something invisible that pressed on my chest, on my mind, making it hard to think. Then I heard it again. A voice. Low, rasping, barely a whisper. You've made it this far, but it's not over. I whirled around, but there was no one there. Just the reflection of my own panic-stricken face staring back at me, growing more distorted with each second. The walls continued to close in, inch by inch, squeezing the air out of the room. The key in my hand, was it still the same key? The same key that had unlocked every door, only to trap me further inside? I looked at the key. It was different now, no longer solid metal, but almost translucent. Like it was made of light, flickering and warping before my eyes. I didn't know what it meant, but I couldn't stop myself from reaching for the next door, the next room, the next trap. I twisted the key into another lock. The door opened with a soft click. But as it swung inward, I saw something I wasn't prepared for. A figure, standing motionless in the center of the room. It was me. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling as I stared at the figure in front of me. It looked like me, same clothes, same face, same posture, but there was something different about it. Something wrong. The figure stood there, perfectly still, staring at me with empty, hollow eyes. Get out, I whispered to it, my voice cracking. But it didn't move. It didn't speak. I took a step back, and then another. I had to get away. This was wrong. Everything was wrong. The walls started to press in again, and I realized I wasn't in control anymore. The doors, the rooms, the blood, it was all part of the trap. The maze. The hunt. It had been waiting for me to make a mistake. And now, I had to face it. I had to confront what I had become. I turned to run, but the room changed again. The walls folded in on themselves, the floor bending and twisting beneath my feet. I stumbled, falling forward, my hands scraping against the rough surfaces, but I couldn't get a grip. The darkness swallowed me whole. And then, there was only silence. When I opened my eyes, I was back where I started. The first room. The same locked door. The same key. But the figure was gone. I stood there, my hands shaking, unsure of what was real anymore. The blood was gone. The walls were still. The only thing that remained was the key in my hand, the same key I had used to open every door. Was it over? Had I escaped? I didn't know. I didn't want to know. I turned toward the door, ready to leave, but as I reached for the handle, something caught my eye. A shadow, stretching across the floor, moving in a direction that wasn't mine. And I realized, with a cold dread creeping into my bones, that I would never escape. Because the doors, they were never meant to open. The key was never meant to unlock anything. I stood frozen, my hand still hovering over the doorknob, unable to move. The shadow, no, it was more than a shadow, was growing, stretching, shifting toward me, as though it were alive. It seemed to have no clear shape, but I could feel it, creeping, curling, a dark presence that slithered along the floor like smoke. My breath caught in my chest, heart racing faster than I thought possible. I turned around slowly, not daring to look at the thing behind me. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, each corner filled with darkness. The walls, once solid, familiar, were now warped, their surfaces undulating as if breathing, shifting with every step I took. I had to leave. I had to get out of this place. But the more I tried to focus, the more the room seemed to change. I couldn't tell what was real anymore, and I couldn't trust my own mind. The familiar door, the key in my hand, all of it felt like a cruel joke. I stepped away from the door, turning down the hallway, but the walls closed in around me. The temperature dropped, and I could feel my breath freezing in the air. There was no escape. Every direction I turned only led to more corridors, more rooms, more locked doors that would only trap me further. And then, there it was. A door at the end of the hallway. It was different, older, more weathered. It looked almost out of place, as though it had been there longer than the rest, like it belonged to a time long past. Something about it tugged at me, a strange, unexplainable pull that urged me forward. I approached the door slowly, my heart thudding in my chest. It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense anymore. But I couldn't stop myself. I reached out and grabbed the doorknob. It was cold to the touch, ice cold, as though it had been untouched for centuries. I turned the knob. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The room was smaller, darker than the others. It was empty, save for one thing, a single chair sitting in the center of the room, facing away from me. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stood there, staring at the chair, as a creeping dread filled me. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. A voice, soft, whispering, too quiet to hear clearly, came from the chair. Sit. I flinched, my body tense. The voice seemed to wrap around me, curling through the air like smoke. It was familiar, but I couldn't place it. I didn't want to place it. But the voice came again, louder this time. Sit. I stepped forward, slowly, my legs trembling. The urge to sit was overwhelming, pulling at me like an invisible force. I reached for the chair. As my hand touched the back of it, I saw something. A shadow, no, a figure, emerged from the chair, a face I couldn't recognize, but somehow, I knew it. It was me. The face was a distorted version of my own, twisted and contorted in ways that defied logic. Eyes too wide, lips stretched in a grin that didn't belong. The figure reached out with hands that seemed to claw at the air, and the shadows around it seemed to twist in time with its movements. And then the voice spoke again, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was clear, loud, filling the entire room. Do you remember? I didn't answer. I couldn't answer. The figure stood up, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was fighting against some invisible force. It stepped toward me, its grin widening, revealing sharp teeth that shouldn't have existed. Do you remember what you did? I backed away, heart hammering in my chest. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing against me, suffocating me with their pressure. I couldn't breathe. The shadows were everywhere, filling the space, wrapping themselves around me like a thick, suffocating blanket. The figure reached out, its cold hands brushing against my cheek, and I could feel the coldness of its touch seep into my skin, into my very bones. I stumbled backward, but the figure followed me, its twisted grin never leaving its face. Do you remember? The words echoed in my mind, louder now, filling every corner of the room, of my thoughts, of my soul. It wasn't just asking a question. It was a command, a demand. I couldn't remember. I didn't want to remember. But as the figure stepped closer, as its twisted grin grew larger, I realized something that chilled me to my core. I wasn't in control. The door slammed shut behind me. The room was no longer a room, it was a prison, and I was its captive. The figure lunged forward. And I knew then that there was no escape. Not from the room. Not from the door. Not from myself. I had become part of the trap. The trap had always been me. It all began with a simple invitation. Come over for dinner tonight. I'll have a nice spread ready. Don't be shy. I stared at the note, my hand still gripping the edge of the paper. It was written in shaky handwriting, the ink slightly smudged. The name at the bottom was familiar, Herman, my neighbor. But there was something about it. Something about the way the letters blurred together as if the message had been hastily scrawled. Herman lived alone in a house that had seen better days. His place was a crumbling structure at the end of the street, its paint peeling like skin. The front porch sagged under the weight of years, and the windows always seemed to be covered in a haze of dirt and grime. The place had an eerie presence, like a house trying to hide something. I didn't know much about Herman, other than that he was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that made you wonder if he had ever been part of the world outside his home. But it wasn't the invitation that made me hesitate. It was the house itself. Still, curiosity got the better of me. What harm could there be? I folded the note, pocketed it, and left my apartment, the cool evening air brushing against my skin. The street was empty, no sounds, no cars passing by. Just the hum of the wind through the trees. When I reached Herman's house, the front door was ajar. I knocked once, but received no answer. Hesitant, I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The house was dimly lit, the air musty with the smell of mildew and old wood. The walls were lined with faded pictures of places I didn't recognize. And in the corner, an old armchair sat alone, facing the wall. I swallowed hard, stepping further into the house. Herman? I called, but my voice seemed to disappear, swallowed by the silence of the house. A moment passed, and then I heard him. His voice, low and raspy, came from somewhere deeper within the house. Back here, in the kitchen, he called. I made my way through a narrow hallway and into the kitchen. There, at the table, sat Herman, an older man with graying hair and dark circles under his eyes. He smiled at me, a thin, strange smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Good of you to come, he said, gesturing to the table. It was set with a mismatched array of dishes. There were roast potatoes, a bowl of soup, some bread, and a strange meat I couldn't quite place. Please, sit, he insisted, and I did, but my unease grew with each passing second. The conversation started slow, polite chatter about the weather, about the neighborhood, but soon it took a turn. Herman leaned forward, his gaze fixed on me, and the air seemed to grow heavier. You know, he began, his voice lowering, I have something special I'd like to show you. I raised an eyebrow, unsure of what he meant. A treasure, he added, his eyes glinting. A real treasure. It's in the basement. The word basement struck a chord with me. The house seemed old and poorly kept, and I hadn't seen any indication that the basement was in a state worth seeing. I think I'd better get going, I said, the sudden desire to leave bubbling up. But Herman shook his head. No, I insist. Just a quick look, and then you can leave if you wish. Against my better judgment, I followed him as he stood, his movements slow and deliberate. He led me toward a door at the end of the hallway. I could feel the air growing colder as we approached, a faint chill creeping under my skin. The door creaked open, and we descended the stairs. The basement was dark, the smell of damp earth and rot filling the air. I could barely make out the shapes of old furniture covered in sheets, forgotten remnants of another time. The light from the single bulb hanging above flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Herman reached for something on the far side of the room, his hand shaking slightly. He pulled something out from behind a tarp. At first, I didn't see it clearly. It looked like a large, old chest, but as Herman moved closer to the light, I saw that it was not a chest at all. It was a cage. A metal cage, rusted with age, and inside it, something I couldn't comprehend. A figure, curled up in the darkness, barely visible. My heart skipped a beat. Herman smiled again, that same unsettling smile. "This is my treasure," he whispered. "This is what I've been keeping." The figure in the cage stirred. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I saw it clearly now. It was a person, or at least, it had once been a person. It was hunched, its limbs twisted in unnatural angles. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, with veins that bulged like thick ropes beneath the surface. The thing's eyes opened, and I saw that they were no longer human. They were black as coal, voids that seemed to stare directly into my soul. It hissed, a low, guttural sound, and I stumbled backward, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Herman reached out, placing a hand on my shoulder, his grip cold and firm. "Don't worry," he said softly. "It won't bite. Not unless I tell it to." A sudden, gut-wrenching realization washed over me. I wasn't just a guest in this house. I was a part of the plan. A part of the twisted game Herman had been playing. I looked around for an escape, but the basement door was gone. And so was the way out. My heart pounded in my chest as I spun around, eyes darting between the walls of the basement. The door was gone. The hallway was gone. There was no escape, no way out. The cold air pressed against my skin, tightening like a vice. My breath came in rapid, shallow gasps as I turned back toward Herman, who stood silently, his eyes glinting with an unsettling calmness. "You see," Herman began, his voice soft and eerily calm, this is what I've been searching for. It's not just a treasure. It's a solution. A way out. A way to be free of the world above." I couldn't take my eyes off the creature in the cage. It shifted slightly, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. I felt my stomach twist in knots as I realized that whatever this thing was, it wasn't human anymore. It wasn't anything that should have existed in this world. What is it?" I managed to croak, my voice barely above a whisper. Herman's gaze never left the creature, his face filled with an almost reverent expression. "It's the result of many years of study. I've found a way to bring the forgotten to life, to trap them in this world. And now, you are part of it." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. My mind raced, trying to piece together what Herman meant. Study? Forgotten? What was he talking about? And why had he invited me here? Suddenly, the creature in the cage moved again, its black eyes fixating on me. A shiver ran down my spine as it hissed once more, a sound that echoed through the basement, making the walls feel like they were closing in on me. Its movements were jerky and unsettling, and I could swear that it was trying to reach out, its twisted fingers curling toward me. "Don't get too close," Herman warned, but there was a strange satisfaction in his tone. "It's not yet ready, but you'll be the one to help it finish what it started." Before I could process what he meant, Herman stepped toward the cage, his hand reaching for the lock. "It needs a little encouragement," he said. I felt a surge of panic flood my body. I had to get out. I had to escape. But the fear seemed to freeze me in place. My legs refused to move, my mind overwhelmed with the horror unfolding before me. Herman unlocked the cage, and for a moment, everything stood still. The creature didn't move, its eyes still locked on me as if it could sense my terror. And then, in an instant, it lunged. I barely had time to react as it shot toward me, its arms reaching out like claws. A burst of adrenaline coursed through me, and I finally moved, stumbling back, nearly tripping over the jagged floor. The creature's hiss echoed in my ears as I scrambled to my feet, heart hammering in my chest. But Herman was faster. He grabbed my arm, his grip cold and unyielding. "You're not leaving," he said, his voice filled with a strange satisfaction. "Not yet. The game has only just begun." My mind raced. I had to break free. I had to escape before it was too late. But the basement, the house itself, it seemed alive now, as if the walls were closing in on me, suffocating me with their ancient weight. "Let me go!" I shouted, but my voice felt weak, lost in the oppressive air of the basement. Herman only smiled, his expression twisted in a way I hadn't seen before. "There is no escape. Not for you. Not for anyone who enters here. You're part of this now, just like I am. Forever." The creature hissed again, its movements more frantic as it struggled against the confines of the cage. I could hear the sound of something scraping against metal, its claws making horrible screeching noises. I jerked my arm free, but the force of Herman's grip left my skin raw. Desperation surged through me. There had to be something, anything I could do to escape this nightmare. As my gaze darted around the room, I spotted a broken window in the far corner of the basement. It was small, barely large enough for me to fit through, but it was an opening, an opportunity. I made a split-second decision, ignoring the sting of the raw skin on my arm. I sprinted toward the window, ignoring Herman's calls behind me. I reached the window and shoved at it, the glass shattering with a loud crack. The sound seemed to reverberate through the basement, a terrible noise that filled the space with even more tension. I didn't look back. Without thinking, I threw my body through the shattered window, landing hard on the ground outside. The cold night air hit my skin like a slap, but I didn't stop. I ran. I ran until my legs burned, until the house was nothing but a dark silhouette against the night sky. The sounds of the basement, the hissing, the scraping, faded into the distance. But even as I ran, I could feel it. The creature's eyes. Watching. And Herman's twisted smile. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But I knew. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. I didn't stop running until I was far from the house, too far to see the dim light from the broken windows. But the cold night air didn't help. It bit at my skin and numbed my mind, but no matter how much I tried to push it away, the thoughts kept creeping in. The basement. The creature. Herman's cold smile. I stumbled, my legs shaky, my heart still racing. Every breath felt like a struggle. The sound of my footsteps was the only thing I could hear in the silence, the faint crunch of snow underfoot. There was nothing else. Just the oppressive quiet of the dark night. But I knew it wasn't over. It couldn't be. The moment I had escaped, I had felt something in the air change, like a heavy weight settling on my chest. Someone was watching me. I stopped, my breath coming in quick bursts. I glanced over my shoulder, but all I saw were the trees swaying in the wind, the shadows stretching long across the ground. There was nothing there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I began walking, but my legs felt weak, my body trembling with the shock of what had just happened. The thought of Herman's twisted grin, the creature's eyes locked on me, haunted every step. I needed to get home. I needed to feel safe again, but the further I walked, the more the weight of my fear grew. It was as if something was chasing me, lingering just behind, too close to ignore. Eventually, I reached the edge of the woods and stepped out into the empty street. My house was a few blocks away, but the walk felt endless. The streetlights flickered above me, casting strange shadows that seemed to move while I wasn't looking directly at them. I quickened my pace, desperate to get inside, to lock the door, to feel the comfort of my own space. My mind spun with confusion and dread. What had Herman meant by part of it? What was that creature? And why had he invited me? As I turned the corner toward my street, I saw my house in the distance. The warm glow of the lights from my windows seemed like a beacon of safety. But as I got closer, I noticed something strange. The front door was slightly ajar. I stopped in my tracks. It was impossible. I had locked it when I left earlier. I was sure of it. But now, the door was open, just a crack. My stomach twisted as a chill ran down my spine. Carefully, I approached, my every step measured, like a predator was watching me. I pushed the door open slowly, the creaking sound echoing in the stillness of the night. "Hello?" My voice was shaky, too loud in the quiet of the house. No answer. The living room was still, undisturbed, but the air felt different. Heavier. The door had been opened, but there was no sign of anyone inside. My heart raced, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move at the corner of my vision. A shadow? Or was it just my mind playing tricks on me? I stepped inside cautiously, scanning the room. Nothing. Just the stillness. The empty space. But that feeling that someone else was there, it lingered, like an unseen presence that refused to leave. I made my way to the kitchen, and that's when I saw it. The note, resting on the table. I hadn't left it there. It was a small piece of paper, folded in half. My hands trembled as I reached for it, unfolding it slowly, almost afraid of what I might find. The note simply read, "You cannot escape. You are already a part of it." I froze. The words burned into my mind, sending a wave of terror through me. My pulse quickened as I slowly turned around, my eyes scanning the shadows in the room. The door was still open. The night still stretched beyond it, silent and endless. But I felt it then, the weight of something dark, something that had followed me all the way back home. It wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Slammed the door shut behind me, the sound of it locking reverberating through the silence of the house. My breath came in short, quick gasps, as though I couldn't catch it fast enough. The note still clutched in my hand felt heavier with every passing second, the words searing into my thoughts, each one a chill creeping down my spine. You cannot escape. You are already a part of it. What did that even mean? I stood frozen in the middle of the room, staring at the walls, my mind racing. The shadows around me seemed to shift, like they were watching, waiting. The house felt wrong. Too quiet. Too still. It was as though the world outside had disappeared and I was the last person left, isolated in a place that was no longer familiar. I dropped the note onto the kitchen table, my hands trembling as I ran my fingers through my hair, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The sound of my heartbeat was deafening, filling my ears, making it harder to think straight. I tried to focus, to tell myself that I was just imagining things, that Herman had somehow found a way to mess with my head. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Something had followed me back here. A faint noise cut through the air, a scrape, soft and barely audible, but unmistakable. It came from upstairs. I froze, my pulse spiking. I hadn't heard anything when I came in, and I was sure I was alone. Yet now, the house felt too alive, too aware of me. My legs moved before I even made a decision, and I found myself walking toward the stairs, my breath shallow and rapid. The sound came again, faint, like something dragging across the floor, just barely perceptible, but unmistakably close. The darkness of the hallway seemed to grow thicker as I climbed, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. With every step, the air felt colder, like the house had grown colder, or maybe I was just losing my mind. It was too quiet. The kind of silence that's suffocating, that presses on your ears and makes you want to scream just to break it. But I couldn't. I couldn't make a sound. I reached the top of the stairs, the wooden floor creaking beneath my feet. The light from the hallway barely touched the corners of the rooms, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out toward me. The scraping noise came again, louder this time. I turned toward the guest room, where I thought I'd heard the sound coming from. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the door handle, my fingers cold, slick with sweat. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see the dim light from the hallway spilling into the room. I pushed it open. The room was empty. There was no one here. No strange figure, no creature lurking in the corner. Just the quiet, empty space I'd left when I come home earlier. But the air felt different, heavier, as though it had been waiting for me. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the room. The bed, the desk, the chair, all perfectly in place. But then I saw it. A small, broken object on the floor near the bed. A glass figurine. I didn't recognize it, but the shards that scattered across the floor were all too familiar, the same jagged shapes, the same sharp edges. I bent down slowly, careful not to touch the shards, my gaze fixed on the tiny cracks that marred the floor. And then I saw it. A footprint. Not on the glass, but on the floor. A single, muddy footprint, the print of a heavy boot. I stood there, paralyzed. Had I made it? Had I walked past this earlier without noticing? The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, a cold shiver crawling down my spine. No. I hadn't noticed it before. It wasn't mine. Someone else had been here. I straightened up, my heart hammering in my chest. There was no way I was imagining this. There was no way I could have missed that. I took a step back, then another, my mind spinning with the terrifying realization that something, or someone, had entered my house. Without warning, the door slammed shut behind me. I whipped around, gasping, my pulse skyrocketing. The door was locked. I hadn't heard anyone come up the stairs, hadn't heard the door creak open. But someone had closed it. I was trapped. The shadows in the hallway seemed to move again. I could hear them now, creeping closer, the slow, deliberate scrape of something dragging across the floor, just out of sight. I backed away from the door, my body trembling. The walls seemed to press in around me, the air thick with the feeling of being watched. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And then, through the darkness, I heard a voice. Low. Whispering. Stay with me. I spun around, but there was no one there. No one in the hallway, no figure standing in the doorway. Just silence. I took a step back, feeling the cold press of the walls against me, my pulse still hammering in my chest. The voice was gone, but its echo lingered, curling around me like a shadow I couldn't escape. It was as if the house itself had spoken, the walls, the floor, the air, all alive with something dark and unnatural. I turned toward the hallway again, my feet unsteady beneath me. The silence was suffocating now, thick and heavy, wrapping itself around my thoughts. The door, how had it closed? I hadn't seen anyone. The voice had come from nowhere. But the feeling, it was undeniable. Something, or someone, was here with me. I started to walk, my body stiff with fear, my eyes darting around the hallway. Every corner, every shadow seemed to hide something waiting to strike. The light from the hallway flickered, casting brief, erratic flashes of light that only seemed to heighten my anxiety. The house was breathing, alive with its own rhythm. Suddenly, a thud echoed from below, sharp and unmistakable. It sounded like a door slamming. I froze. I knew that sound. The front door had opened, then closed, as if someone had just entered. But it couldn't have been. I was sure the door had been locked. I was sure I had checked it. Another thud followed, and then a slow, deliberate dragging noise, a scraping sound that was becoming all too familiar. Someone was downstairs. I felt my legs move before I could stop them, my body almost moving on its own. I had to see. I had to know. I couldn't stay in this hallway, with the walls closing in around me, with the shadows shifting. I had to face whatever was out there. I reached the top of the stairs, peering down into the darkness below. The house felt endless now, a maze of rooms and corridors, each one hiding something I couldn't see. The staircase creaked under my weight as I slowly descended, the soft, rhythmic thud of my steps the only sound in the oppressive quiet. At the bottom of the stairs, I hesitated. The door was wide open, the faintest light spilling through from the streetlights outside. But nothing moved in the open space. No figure, no shadow, just the empty, cold air. I stepped forward, my breath shallow, my heart racing. My eyes skimmed the living room. The door was shut, the furniture untouched. The house had not changed. But the noise, the dragging sound, it was closer now. It came from the far corner of the room, near the basement door. The heavy, wooden door that had never been opened in my time here. I didn't want to go down there. I didn't want to open it, but the compulsion was overwhelming. My hand found the handle, cold to the touch, and I twisted it slowly, the creak of the door groaning in protest. The air in the basement was thick with dust and must, the smell of something old and forgotten. As I descended the steps, my footfalls sounded too loud, too obvious, like they would give me away. The staircase seemed to stretch forever, the darkness below swallowing the light. When I reached the bottom, I paused, my eyes scanning the room. It was worse than I'd imagined. The walls were covered in mold, the concrete floor cracked and uneven. There was a strange, pungent smell in the air, something sour, something decayed. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the room, a faint outline of something that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was a shadow, but as I stepped closer, I realized it was more than that. It was a figure, thin, bent, almost skeletal. The shape of a person, hunched over in the corner, motionless. I should have turned and run. I should have screamed. But I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. Slowly, I stepped forward, my breath coming faster now, my skin prickling. As I got closer, I saw that it wasn't just a person. The figure was sitting on the floor, its head tilted unnaturally to one side, staring at the floor with empty eyes. It wasn't human. The thing was wrong. Its skin was stretched too thin, its bones visible beneath, like some kind of grotesque mockery of a person. The darkness around it seemed to pulse, to breathe with an eerie rhythm that made my stomach turn. I took a step back, but then the thing moved. It tilted its head slowly, the sound of bone cracking in the silence. Its eyes lifted to me, mine empty, hollow, but filled with a hunger I couldn't understand. It opened its mouth, and the whisper returned. The same voice I had heard before. "Stay with me." I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. My head was spinning, my legs weak beneath me. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the thing in the corner. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But its presence, its eyes, they were too real. Too close. The scraping noise began again. Slowly, it started to move toward me, dragging itself across the floor with jerky, uneven movements. Each drag of its limbs sent a shiver down my spine, and I realized its mouth was opening wider, wider with every movement, as if it were getting ready to scream. But no sound came. Only the whisper. "Stay with me." And in that moment, I realized the true meaning of the note. It wasn't just a warning. It was an invitation. And now, I had no way to leave. I couldn't breathe. Every part of me wanted to run, to escape, to get as far away from the thing in the corner as possible. But my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the air itself had turned to stone, holding me in place, freezing me to the spot. The figure in the corner shifted again, dragging its body closer with agonizing slowness. Its eyes never left me, those hollow, dark sockets that seemed to pierce into my very soul. The closer it got, the more suffocating the air became. I could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on me, crushing me with its horrible, unnatural hunger. "Stay with me," the voice whispered again, the words now a sickening echo that seemed to come from all directions. I forced myself to take a step back, but it was like wading through thick mud. The room seemed to expand, stretching further and further until the walls became a blur, a never-ending void of darkness. The thing was right in front of me now, its broken, skeletal face so close that I could feel the coldness of its breath on my skin. It reached out with its long, bony fingers, brushing against my chest, and I couldn't stop myself from shuddering. "Stay with me." I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The fear was so overwhelming that it swallowed my voice, and I could only stand there, trembling, my eyes locked onto the creature before me. I had to get away. I had to escape. But where? The stairs, the door, everything had disappeared. The room was a labyrinth, closing in around me. There was no way out. My mind raced, trying to find some solution, some way to survive. The creature, it wasn't just a monster, it was something else. Something tied to this place, to the house itself. It had been waiting for me. It had been calling me. And now that it had me, it wasn't going to let me go. Suddenly, I remembered the keys. The keys I'd found earlier. Maybe one of them could help me. I didn't know how or why, but I had to try. I reached into my pocket, my hands shaking, my breath ragged. The keys were still there, cold against my skin. I pulled them out, fumbling with them, my mind a blur of panic. I had to choose. I had to make a choice. I looked back at the creature, its mouth opening wider, its jaw cracking with a sickening snap. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and its eyes, those eyes, were now filled with something far worse than hunger. There was anticipation, like it was savoring the moment before it consumed me entirely. With trembling fingers, I reached for the first key. The one that looked old, worn. The one that felt wrong. I slid it into the lock that appeared out of nowhere, the sound of the mechanism clicking in place echoing in the stillness. I turned it, and the world exploded. The walls, the floor, the creature, it all shattered in an instant. The space around me warped, distorted, as if the house itself was unraveling. The house groaned like a dying animal as I was sucked into the blackness. There was no light, no sound, no time. Just the weight of something vast, something that had been hiding in the cracks of reality itself, pulling me down into its endless void. Then, everything went silent. I couldn't tell how long I had been falling, or was it standing? The darkness pressed against me, suffocating, but I could still feel the cold weight of the key in my hand. It was the only thing that remained, the only thing I could hold on to. And then, as if by magic, the light flickered back into existence. I was standing in the middle of the street, outside the house. The cold night air brushed against my skin, the stars above twinkling innocently. The house stood there, dark and silent, as if nothing had ever happened. But something had changed. I was no longer the same person who had walked into that house. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, clung to me like a second skin. The thing in the basement, it wasn't gone. I could still feel its eyes on me, could still hear its whisper in my mind. Stay with me. The house was quiet, but I knew it was far from empty. It was waiting. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how many miles I put between myself and that cursed place, I could never escape the grip it had on me. I couldn't remember if I had ever left at all. The darkness was still with me. It was late. The kind of late when the road starts to stretch on forever and every tree looks like a dark shadow lurking just beyond your headlights. I had been driving for hours, the quiet hum of the engine keeping me company, when I saw them. A group of children walking along the side of the road, small figures moving slowly, almost aimlessly, in the darkness. At first, I thought nothing of it. It was strange, sure, but not out of the ordinary. There were no streetlights on this stretch of road, just the dim glow of my headlights, and I couldn't see much beyond the outline of their silhouettes. I thought maybe they had wandered from a nearby house or camp. But as I got closer, something about them didn't sit right. They were walking in the middle of the road, not on the shoulder, like they didn't notice the cars passing by. I slowed down, my eyes narrowing as I tried to make sense of it. Why were they out here so late? No parent would let their kids walk down a country road at night. The idea seemed strange, off. I pulled over to the side, my tires crunching on the gravel, the sound of the engine shutting off echoing in the night. The children didn't look up. They just kept walking, their footsteps a steady rhythm. Hey! I called out, my voice louder than I intended. Are you okay? You shouldn't be out here this late. The group came to a halt, but no one turned around. It wasn't until I stepped out of the car that they finally looked over their shoulders. At first glance, they seemed like ordinary children. There were 3 of them, maybe 4, huddled together in their oversized jackets, their faces pale and covered by messy hair. But something about their eyes caught my attention. They were too wide, too dark, as if they hadn't blinked in hours. Their gazes were unsettling, too focused, too still. "Do you need help?" I asked again, taking a cautious step toward them. They didn't speak. The silence between us grew thick, heavy, like the air had turned to lead. One of the children, a girl with long, stringy hair, tilted her head slightly, as if studying me. "Where are your parents?" I asked, my voice faltering just a little. She didn't answer. Instead, she smiled, wide, too wide, her lips stretching unnaturally. And then the others started smiling too, their faces twisting into grins that didn't belong on children. "Come with us," the girl said softly. Her voice was sweet, but there was something wrong about it. It was too calm, too inviting. I froze, a shiver running down my spine. I wanted to tell them to go home, to leave me alone, but my mouth wouldn't work. It was like I was trapped in the air, frozen in place by their stares. The air seemed to grow colder. I noticed then that the road around us was eerily quiet, no crickets chirping, no rustling of leaves, just the distant hum of the highway. I took a step back, my hand instinctively reaching for the door handle of my car. "I'm not going with you," I said, my voice shaking more than I cared to admit. The girl's smile never wavered. Instead, she tilted her head again, and the others followed suit, mirroring her movements as if they were rehearsed. "Please, stay with us," she cooed, her voice now a soft whisper in the night. Something in her voice made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It wasn't right. None of this was right. I started to retreat toward my car, but as I moved, I noticed something. The children, still standing perfectly still, hadn't moved. They were closer now, just a few feet away. Ow! I hadn't seen them move. I looked down the road, and my heart skipped a beat. The road was longer now. It stretched out farther than I remembered, the dark shapes of the trees lining it casting long shadows across the pavement. I turned back to the children, but they were still there, watching me, their faces frozen in that disturbing, unblinking smile. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, panic rising in my chest as I realized the car door was stuck, as if the road itself had trapped me here. The children were watching, waiting, their eyes never leaving mine. The girl stepped closer, her feet making no sound on the gravel. I stumbled backward, almost falling over in my haste to get away. "Come," she whispered again, her voice sliding into my mind, cold and smooth. "Come see the road with us." It was then that I saw it, something I had missed before. The shadows beneath the children were wrong. They weren't just shadows. They were moving, twisting, crawling along the ground like living things, shifting unnaturally. The children's feet weren't even touching the ground, they hovered just above it, their bodies jerking slightly as though their movements weren't entirely their own. I stumbled backward, panic overwhelming me. I wasn't thinking anymore. I was running. I didn't know how I managed to get back in the car, but somehow I did. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, my heart hammering in my chest. I slammed the car into reverse, spinning the wheels in the gravel as I sped backward, away from the children, away from the road that no longer felt like a road at all. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, they were still there. The children stood in the middle of the road, their grinning faces staring back at me, their eyes gleaming with something ancient and terrifying. The road stretched on forever, and the children, they were following. I slammed my foot on the gas, the engine roaring to life as I pushed the pedal to the floor. The tires screeched on the gravel, and I felt the car lurch forward. But the speed, the sound, the movement, none of it mattered. I could still feel their presence behind me. The children's faces burned into my mind, their eyes following me, their smiles never fading. The headlights cut through the night, but they seemed to illuminate nothing but an endless stretch of road. My hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, but the children were gone. I couldn't see them. I should have felt relieved, but I didn't. Something deep inside me told me they weren't gone. They were still there, somewhere, watching, waiting. I pushed the car faster, faster, faster. The road twisted and turned, but I didn't care anymore. I couldn't stop. I had to get out of there. But as I rounded a bend in the road, something caught my eye. In the darkness ahead, a figure stood in the middle of the road. A silhouette, small and pale, just like the children. My heart stopped. I knew what it was before I could even see its face. It was one of them. One of the children. I slammed my foot on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car jerked forward, barely stopping in time. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me. I could see its eyes glimmer in the light, wide and unblinking, and the smile, that terrible, twisted smile, spread across its face again. My mind raced, my breath quickening. I had no choice. There was no way around it. I threw the car into reverse and backed up as fast as I could, my eyes glued to the figure in the road, praying it wouldn't move. But as I backed up, something shifted in the darkness. Another figure appeared. And another. Soon, they were everywhere. The children, all of them, standing in the middle of the road, their eyes fixed on me, their smiles growing wider, their forms shifting in ways that made my stomach turn. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't escape. They began to move toward me, slow at first, but with each step, they grew closer, their feet barely touching the ground. The air grew colder, the night thicker, and their eyes were now filled with something more than just curiosity. They weren't just looking at me anymore. They were hunting me. And I knew, deep down, that there was nowhere to run. I turned the wheel hard to the left, slamming the car into the trees, hoping to find an escape, hoping to find anything to break free from the nightmare. But the forest was endless. The trees were a blur, their shadows warping into dark, twisting shapes that seemed to reach for me. And through it all, their laughter followed. It was soft at first, like a whisper in the wind. Then it grew louder, more insistent, until it echoed around me, surrounding me, drowning me in the sound. The children's laughter, cruel and mocking, ringing in my ears, as if they were everywhere. As if I were already lost. I don't know how long I drove. Hours? Minutes? Time seemed to stretch and bend in ways that didn't make sense. I kept my foot on the gas, my eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror, desperate to see something, anything, that would tell me they weren't following anymore. But they were there, behind me, in the dark, their faces reflecting in the mirror, their eyes gleaming in the headlights. I had escaped the road, but the road wasn't done with me. The children were still with me. They were always with me. I don't know why I stopped, but eventually, my body, frozen from tension, forced me to pull over. I couldn't drive forever. The car lurched to a halt, the engine ticking in the dead silence of the night. My hands still gripped the steering wheel, fingers cramping from the force. I felt my breath rasping in and out, but the sound was drowned by the unsettling quiet that surrounded me. I stared out through the windshield, trying to focus, trying to make sense of what was happening. The road ahead seemed normal, empty. The forest, the figures, the children, they were all gone. But the silence, it felt wrong. Not peaceful. Heavy. Stifling. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. I knew what I'd see. I didn't want to see their faces again. The faces I could no longer forget, no matter how hard I tried. The cold air of the night seeping through the car window made me shiver, but I didn't dare roll it up. Something about the air felt different, thicker, heavier, as if it was pressing against me. I looked around, half expecting to see something, anything, movement, shadows, or even a sign of life. But there was nothing. Just the road. Just the trees. And just me. I tried to calm myself, tried to rationalize. They were just kids. They didn't belong out there in the middle of the road, sure. It didn't make sense. But kids wander. Maybe they were lost. Maybe they'd been out there for a while. Maybe they needed help. But then I remembered the way they moved. The way they looked at me. The way they smiled. I shook my head, trying to shake the thoughts out of my mind. I couldn't let myself believe that. I couldn't think about it any longer. And then the voice came. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even a whisper. It was a thought, clear, sudden, and so distinct, I almost thought I'd heard it aloud. You should go back. My heart stopped. It was so sudden, so unexpected, that it took me a moment to process. I leaned forward, my eyes darting around, trying to find the source of the voice. There was no one. I was completely alone. But the voice didn't leave me. It lingered in my head, like a shadow, growing stronger with every passing second. You should go back. They're waiting. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew in my gut that whatever it wasn't just a thought. It was real. The voice was real. I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling. The urge to get out of the car was overwhelming. I didn't know why. I didn't want to. But the voice, the pressure, it was like a pull, something I couldn't escape. I stepped out into the cold night, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes. The air was sharp, biting at my skin, and yet it felt wrong. It felt too quiet, too empty, like everything around me had been drained of life. I walked a few paces, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. And then I heard it, the faintest sound, almost imperceptible, coming from behind me. It was a whisper. Soft at first, barely a sound, but growing louder. Turn around. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest, my body trembling with dread. My feet refused to move. I could feel the cold sweat prickling on my skin. And then, against every instinct in my body, I slowly turned. I half expected to see nothing. But there they were. The children. They were standing in the trees at the edge of the road, their pale faces barely visible in the dim light. Their eyes, wide and empty, stared at me, unblinking. Their mouths stretched into smiles, those awful, unnatural smiles that sent a wave of nausea through my gut. And then one of them stepped forward. The others remained still, watching, waiting, but one child, maybe the youngest, a girl stepped out into the road, her small feet shuffling slowly, deliberately. Her eyes never left me. She was closer now, so close, the smile on her face almost seemed to grow, as if it were stretching. "Come with us." Her voice echoed in my mind again, but this time it wasn't just a thought. It was her voice. Real, unmistakable. I didn't move. I couldn't. My heart raced, the fear constricting my chest. I had to run. I had to leave. But my feet wouldn't obey. It was as if the ground itself was holding me in place. And that's when I realized it wasn't just the children. It was the road. It was everything. I wasn't in control anymore. I wasn't alone anymore. They were all around me. "Come with us." The voice grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just one child now. It was all of them. They were speaking to me, their voices blending into one, filling my mind, suffocating me. I tried to scream, tried to move, but it was too late. The shadows closed in. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place. The world around me had blurred, like a bad dream, the edges of reality losing their clarity. I wanted to look away, to break free from the eyes that felt like they were crawling under my skin, but I couldn't. It was as if the air itself had turned to stone, weighing me down, trapping me in their gaze. The girl, if she even was a girl anymore, moved closer. Her feet made no sound on the gravel, as though the earth had swallowed the noise. Her smile, if you could call it that, stretched wider, as if it was going to split her face in two. And that voice was no longer in my head. It was all around me, inside me. "You can't leave. You're one of us now." My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Sweat beaded on my forehead, my palms slick against the steering wheel I'd somehow still been gripping. My legs felt like they were made of stone, my body paralyzed with terror. The others, the children, if they even were children, remained still, watching me with those vacant eyes. Their limbs, stiff and unnatural, gave no sign of life. They didn't blink. They didn't move. But their presence was overwhelming. It was like they were filling the air, surrounding me with something wrong. The emptiness of the forest around me suddenly seemed alive. The trees shifted, creaked, whispered. The shadows behind them seemed to stretch, elongating like fingers reaching out, as if they were going to grab me and pull me into the darkness. I tried to take a step back, but my legs wouldn't listen. My breath was shallow, each inhale a struggle. Every inch I moved felt like a battle against the pressure in the air, as if something unseen was pushing me closer to the children, drawing me into their reach. The girl, the leader, perhaps, stopped just in front of me. Her hand, small and pale, reached out, the fingers stretched toward me, her grip invisible but unyielding. I felt the pull of it, as if her hand were attached to a chain buried deep within my chest. "Come with us. It's your place now. Don't fight it." I felt sick. I couldn't breathe. The air tasted of metal and something foul, a taste I couldn't name but that twisted in the back of my throat. The child's hand reached further, and I felt her fingers brush against my arm. I jerked back, gasping, and in that instant, the world around me seemed to snap back into focus. I wasn't just standing there anymore. I was running. I don't know how I started moving, whether it was instinct, sheer panic, or something else, but I was running. My legs finally obeyed. My mind screamed at me to keep going, to run as fast as I could, away from the children, away from that suffocating, unnatural force. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I knew they were still there. I could feel their eyes on my back, watching me, feeling every tremor of fear that passed through my body. But I didn't dare stop. I couldn't stop. I reached the car and threw open the door. I slammed it shut behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The engine roared to life, and I shoved the car into gear, speeding down the road. The headlights sliced through the dark, the beam illuminating the empty road ahead, but nothing more. The trees on either side of me seemed to close in as if the forest itself were trying to swallow me whole. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But I knew, deep down, that they were still there. I wasn't sure how much time passed as I drove. The road stretched on, but it felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. It was just a blur, a nightmarish repetition of trees, darkness, and silence, broken only by the hum of the tires on the road. And then, the voice came again. Clear, cold, and unmistakable. You can't escape. I slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched in protest, but the car stopped just in time. I stared at the road ahead, my hands shaking, my mind racing. What was happening? What was chasing me? What were they? I reached for the door handle, but before I could open it, the voice spoke again. Look. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. I turned my head slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. And there they were again. The children. They were standing at the edge of the road, their pale figures silhouetted against the trees. The same empty eyes. The same awful smiles. But this time, they weren't still. They were moving. One by one, they began to cross the road. Their steps were slow, deliberate, but there was no doubt in my mind that they were coming toward me. And with each step they took, the shadows around them grew longer, taller, more menacing. You can't leave. I reached for the car key, my hand trembling uncontrollably. But the key was gone. I tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. The car was dead. And then I heard something worse than the voice. It was a sound. A horrible sound. A low, guttural growl coming from the trees. A sound like something hungry, something ancient and terrible, stirring in the darkness. I knew then that it wasn't just the children I was running from. It was whatever they were waiting for. Whatever had called them here. And I had just driven right into its trap. My heart pounded in my chest as the growl echoed through the air, vibrating the ground beneath me. The children, those hollow-eyed figures, didn't flinch. They simply kept walking toward me, their slow, deliberate steps dragging them closer and closer. The darkness around them seemed to bend and twist, as though the very shadows were alive, moving toward me with each step they took. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The lock was jammed, as if it had been sealed shut by something far beyond my understanding. My breath quickened, and panic surged through me like a tidal wave. I glanced around in a frantic search for any escape, but the road was empty. There was no way out. No other car. No house nearby. Just me, the children, and that terrible growl in the air. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't just a growl anymore. It was the sound of something breathing. Deep, ragged, as if it were inhaling the very life from the night around us. I could feel the weight of it pressing against me, crushing my lungs with its presence. Don't look back, I told myself. but my eyes betrayed me. They locked onto the children as they came closer, their faces still stretched into those wide, grotesque smiles. The leader, the girl, was now standing right in front of the car. Her expression hadn't changed. She wasn't smiling at me anymore, though. No, now she was just watching. Her eyes bored into mine, empty and endless. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Instead, I heard the growl again, louder now, as though it was coming from deep inside her chest, and it seemed to call out to something. I slammed my hands against the steering wheel, but no matter how much I turned the key or pulled at the door, the car remained lifeless. I was trapped. That was when I heard it. A scraping sound. Slow at first, like nails dragging against stone. But it quickly grew louder, more intense. A series of jagged, uneven movements, like something, or someone, was crawling through the underbrush at the edge of the road. I couldn't see what it was, but I felt its presence. It was closing in. Coming closer. I pressed my foot harder on the brake, trying to wake the engine, willing the car to start, but it was useless. The growl was deafening now, rising in pitch, and I felt it in my bones, rattling me to my core. The air around me seemed to distort, like I was staring through a fogged-up window, and everything felt wrong, like reality itself was being torn apart. Then, I saw it. A massive shadow stepped out from the trees. It wasn't human. Not even close. Its limbs were too long, its body too unnatural. I couldn't make out all the details, but I could see the shape of it, and I could feel the overwhelming malevolence radiating from it. It moved toward me with an unsettling grace, dragging its weight across the ground, its eyes glowing like two small orbs of fire. Run. The command in my head was sharp, urgent. It wasn't my own thought. It was the voice. No, not the voice, the presence behind the voice. I didn't hesitate. I kicked open the door, stumbling out of the car and onto the cold, unforgiving gravel. I ran, but where? I didn't know. I couldn't see anything clearly anymore. The world around me had become a swirling blur of darkness, trees, and distorted shadows. The children were behind me, their footsteps quickening, the sound of their laughter, unnatural and mocking, piercing the silence. And that thing in the woods. It was following me, its steps slow and deliberate, but I knew it was closing in. I kept running, my breath ragged in my chest. The sound of my feet against the gravel was drowned out by the growl, the laughter, and the unnatural whispers that filled the night air. The trees seemed to close in around me, the road narrowing, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Don't look back, I told myself again, but I couldn't help it. I had to know how close they were. I had to know if I was going to make it out. I turned just for a second. And there they were. The children. They weren't running. They weren't chasing me anymore. They were standing in a line, watching me. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and their smiles stretched wider, stretching their faces in a grotesque parody of joy. And behind them, I saw the thing, the shadow, coming closer. Its glowing eyes locked onto me, and I felt a cold rush of dread flood through me. It wasn't just a creature anymore. It was something else. Something older. Something that had been waiting. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, my legs giving out beneath me. But before I hit the ground, something grabbed me, cold, like ice. The fingers wrapped around my wrist, pulling me back toward the shadows. I screamed, struggling, but the grip was too strong. And then, I realized it wasn't just the children who were hunting me. It was everything in this place. The road, the trees, the very darkness itself. The growl grew louder, and I could hear the whispers now, voices not my own. The thing was close, so close I could feel its breath on my skin. And then, in the midst of the chaos, a voice whispered in my ear, "You should have stayed on the road." And everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, everything was silent. There was no growl, no laughter, no whispers. Just nothing. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it all. Maybe I had fallen asleep in the car. Maybe I had dreamt the whole thing. But as I sat up, I realized something was terribly wrong. The air was thick, suffocating. My chest felt tight, and the ground beneath me was soft, almost as if I were lying on wet earth. I could barely make out shapes around me, blurred figures at the edge of my vision, and I heard nothing. No crickets. No wind. Not even the sound of my breath. I stood up, my legs shaking as I did, and found myself in the middle of a vast, featureless void. There were no trees, no road, no stars overhead, just an endless blackness that stretched in every direction. The only thing I could see clearly was the faint, flickering outline of a road that seemed to wind off into the distance. I wasn't on the road anymore. I tried to take a step forward, but my feet felt heavy, like I was moving through thick mud. The sensation was odd, like my body was moving, but the world around me wasn't responding. I glanced around, but there were no children, no shadow, no creature. There was only the darkness, wrapping around me like a shroud. What is this place? I took another step, but my breath caught in my throat. I heard something in the distance, faint at first, like a whisper. It was quiet, but as I focused, the sound grew louder. A voice. It wasn't the children's laughter. It wasn't the growl. It was something deeper, more ancient. "Stay with US." The words sent a chill down my spine. My body froze. I wasn't alone. I turned around, and there they were. The children. They were standing in a circle, their faces pale and expressionless, their eyes black as night. They weren't moving, but they were watching me. They were always watching me. The sound of their breathing, slow and deliberate, filled the air, and I felt their gaze seeping into my skin, burrowing into my mind. "Stay with us." The words repeated, and I could feel the ground beneath me starting to shift. The road in front of me seemed to stretch longer, disappearing into an endless horizon. The children, they were growing. Their shadows were growing, too, stretching toward me as if the darkness itself was alive, crawling toward me, wanting to consume me. I turned to run, but my legs refused to move. It was as if the earth had grown heavy, pulling me back, holding me in place. The world felt like it was closing in on me, like the shadows were trying to swallow me whole. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath ragged and panicked. I tried again to move, but it was useless. I couldn't escape. "Stay with US." The voice was louder now. It was no longer a whisper. It was a command, a compulsion, seeping into my thoughts, making my mind go hazy. The children's faces twisted, their eyes gleaming with a malevolent hunger. They weren't children anymore. They were something worse. And then, I saw it. The shadow, the thing that had been chasing me, stepped out from behind the circle of children. It was massive, its form impossibly tall and twisted, its limbs contorted in unnatural angles. Its eyes gleamed like embers in the dark, and its mouth stretched open in a grotesque grin. It reached toward me with long, skeletal fingers, and I could feel its touch before it even made contact. The cold seeped into my bones, an ice-cold void that made me feel like I was being torn apart from the inside out. "You cannot escape." The voice was not just in my ears. It was inside my mind, a presence that was everywhere, filling every corner of my consciousness. It was overwhelming, suffocating, and I felt my grip on reality slipping. The darkness was pulling me in, its weight too much to bear. I closed my eyes, unable to move, unable to scream. The last thing I felt was the coldness of its fingers as they wrapped around my throat, squeezing the breath from my lungs. And then, there was nothing. Just an endless void. And the children's laughter. The last thing I remember was their eyes, those endless, black eyes, watching me as I disappeared into the darkness. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.